they had to declare women persons? What, that wasn't clear to anybody?
I don't think that as a 26-year-old feminist, I should have to feel stigmatized for claiming that I'm a feminist. Like, my mom had to deal with that, right? Like, come on. And like, it's just so frustrating that we're still at that spot.
And there have actually been women my age that say, you know, we don't really need feminism anymore because it's not a problem. And I mean, you can't. It's really quite astonishing the way that society just likes to push everything aside. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. We're good now. And we're not good now.
That's what I need from my femtors in my life, is for them to be able to relate to me in the sense of saying, you know, Natasha, I see and recognize that you're struggling right now and that you're fighting for some very important issues. And let me share some stories with you around how we've struggled and some of the fights that we fought and some of the times that we got kicked in the ass and felt like we couldn't get up again, but we did anyway.
Saskatchewan Working Women was a radical women's activist organization born in the 1970s in Saskatchewan, Canada. The height of its activity was from 1977 to the late 1980s. SWW grew out of the struggles of women within the trade union movement. The organization tackled key issues of working women that were being debated in the women's movement and in broader society.
Come the revolution, girls, all of these things would be resolved. And, you know, like daycare and reproductive rights, and who gave a shit about those things anyway?
I think the initial impetus for an autonomous women's movement came from the experiences that many women had in the left, in various forms of the left, finding that while they were very active and contributed a lot, they didn't always get recognition. And that as women became aware of issues that were more specific to women, these were not only not recognized, but actually denied. There was considerable hostility towards them.
A lot of union women, a lot of ordinary working women simply thought, well, this was just a middle-class women's movement who were people who were burning their bras or whatever, you know, the kind of extremes that were being, you know, the media foisted on the women's movement. And they didn't see it as relevant because it wasn't dealing with their issues.
There were a lot of Marxist-Leninist groups at that point, a lot of groups that were really struggling with the issues of the left in terms of their relationship to political power and to creating a new agenda. And many of the women were involved in different of the left formations, but there was something that we needed more than just being active as leftists. We wanted to be creating a new kind of politics.
So there was a long tradition in Saskatchewan of women being very politically active, but there was not a long tradition of women being publicly recognized or being allowed to speak publicly. And I think by the late 70s, that had pretty much come to a head for many women, not just young women.
At a certain point, even women with their masochistic tendencies get tired of hitting their heads against brick walls and bleeding all the time.
It was extremely difficult to get into decision-making bodies, to be included, to be heard, to have issues, even if they were considered mainstream issues and not just women's issues, to be heard about that.
And we had to not be one of the boys, but certainly not be one of the girls, because that just didn't work. If you were one of the girls, that made you something other than a leader in the union.
There wasn't a forum for dealing with social issues or broader women's issues or broader worker issues at the time either. And I think it made it even worse because as a woman coming forward with that stuff, it was belittled.
They're a funny group. I mean, you know, I worked for them for 20 years in a full-time capacity, and yeah, they get nervous about people who challenge them, especially when it's a group of women. And certainly since the trade union movement has traditionally, and unfortunately still is, dominated by men. So yeah, they were very leery. Communist uprising, you know, usurpers or something. I don't know what they thought of us, but it wasn't always very pleasant for them.
My own philosophical perspective was a humanitarian women's rights, broadly based one, and it was a strategic issue for me that we couldn't, as women, make that case unless we had rights in the workplace, and therefore it was important to struggle for women's rights in the workplace.
Once I knew it was there, it was just something that needed to be part of my life because it was a women's network, because it focused on women in work, and most particularly probably SWW because it didn't focus only on paid work and unionized work, because I was on a farm.
I joined SWW because I was newly active in the union movement and newly active in the left political movement, and SWW was one of those organizations that, as a feminist, trade unionist, socialist, that I needed to be part of.
Women needed to do their own analysis of what was happening because everything was not covered already by all the various left-wing political organizations. And that we felt that there was a huge area that was not being addressed. And so we decided that we needed a women's organization that was class-based, that could talk about sexism and racism and class, and try to come to grips with what we were going to do about that as an organization.
Most women are by and large getting 55% the wage that men are getting for performing similar work. We're trying to bring working women together, which we've certainly done successfully on this occasion, to discuss and to try and develop some resolutions about the conditions of working women.
You fight. You have to learn how to struggle and not be afraid of it.
SWW was primarily an urban-based organization, primarily a trade union-based organization. It was an organization that tried to be open and inclusive and tried not to say we're only for women who work in the workplace for wages or women who work for wages and are unionized. And that's important in making any connection with rural women.
SWW was open to all women because all women were working women. And it was that openness, I think, that was unique about it. It's the first thing. I think the second thing was that it, by and large, was a left women's organization. So that we really saw ourselves as women of the left, proudly of the left. And it was a place where we could come together to really talk about political strategy and share our political knowledge, but with a new understanding of the role of women in the political movement.
When I talk about SWW and the women's movement in general, but especially SWW, I think the question of combining hearts and minds, that sort of whole theory of that we have to be intellectual, but we also have to have our heart with us. We have to be compassionate, and we have to be nurturing. And I think especially for women, it makes us, that's how we enjoy politics.
I loved the organization from the first meeting because the women were so warm and they were so smart, and they were all activists, and they all shared the same kind of values that I did, you know, that you don't stand by when there's things to be done and when there's injustices to be addressed. You do it, you know, you get out and you do something about it. So sort of have picket sign, we'll travel.
It was an absolutely safe place to be. It wasn't an easy place to be every day in terms of the kinds of policy discussions we were having. It made us stronger.
Ego was never more important than getting the job done. And so we had some very heated discussions at different points on issues where people felt very passionately one side or the other of an issue. But it never changed the fact we cared a lot about each other, and we could always walk away and still be friends, and people always knew that.
Equal pay, sexual assault, breadth and variety of jobs we do, racism, issues facing Aboriginal women, the double duty day, hours of work.
SWW took on prescient issues 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Obviously, the issues of primary concern to women around childcare, around equality issues, were very much the core of our program. But at the same time, we were looking very much at issues of renewal, of outreach. We struggled deeply around the issues of how to relate to non-white women. for example. The issues of inclusivity were real. They aren't issues that we ever overcame. But we did begin to, engage in dialogue with Aboriginal women, women of color, immigrant women here in Saskatchewan, when I don't think that they were anywhere else.
The double duty day, hours of work, labor laws, pensions, the ceiling that
women in SWW put a lot of time and effort into issues that were more centered on the workplace, if you will, or that type of thing. So we had tech change. We would be interested in health and safety in the workplace. We would be interested in equal pay issues, so on and so forth, and getting people elected.
Marginalize the poor, poverty, benefits for part-time workers.
We had very heated debates in SWW over part-time work, with some of the union sisters saying that part-time work was a strategy of the employers to divide the workforce, and others of us saying no, that people need to have access to part-time work that's well paid and has benefits, etc.
We considered Saskatoon and Regina the urban centers, and that other smaller cities in the province and smaller towns were rural areas. You see, some of the issues were rail line abandonment, closing of schools in rural areas, closing of hospitals, closing of services as the high throughput elevators were just starting to come in.
Just because of the times that it was, that we looked at the work that women do, that we looked at childcare, because childcare was and is very problematical in the country because of distance, because of availability, because of cost, all those things.
There was no real, what I would call daycare when I came to this province in 1972. The government had set up, in hopes of being, I guess, kind of cool and interesting, they set up parent co-ops, which is a very good idea on paper, but then didn't fund them. So what it left was the parents and the daycare workers at each other's throats. Daycare workers were paid minimum wage.
So we tried very hard not to separate and say parents should have childcare at the expense of childcare workers having low wages. And part of that was because we had childcare workers in the organization who brought that point of view. And so in all the things that we tried to do around childcare was to bring those three issues together: the quality, the workers' position, and also the parents' ability to actually afford daycare and to have access to daycare.
And so, within raising those issues, the difference was that we were raising them both within the union movement, but also within the women's movement, and making it important that they make the connection. And we did make the connection.
So one of the things that we decided we'd do is we would learn to beat the bastards at their own rules.
The structure of SWW was, at the provincial level, quite sort of patterned against kind of like president, treasurer, secretary, ordinary convention, strategic, discussions and resolutions and so forth. Where we did that because it was necessary for people to learn, for women to learn how to use that structure. But we did it in a very cooperative way. Whereas at the local level, we had a much more cooperative way of working. I mean, it was sort of like consensus. Giving women support and an idea that they could make a change and that they could be effective and that they didn't need to be silent, that they could actually be aggressive, that they could be political, that they could have their own analysis, and that they could talk about that.
One of the things that we used as a mechanism to develop our policies and our strategies was what we called the gathering and weaving, which was, for me, the way women do things. We gather and we weave.
We did what was called a 5-minute democracy. And women then, it was the first time I'd ever done it. And I mean, to be in a political organization that trusted a group to in 5 minutes determine the priority. And I remember the first time we did it, We all got 5 minutes to make up our mind about what was the priority. And it was virtually unanimous among the hundreds of women that attended this conference that our priority for that year would be childcare.
What was important to me is that we didn't just adopt a position sort of rigidly and sort of just parrot it. That we were never comfortable with a position unless it really felt like it reflected our real life experience of an issue.
The first time an issue ever became discussed, there was often quite a few different perspectives of how you could come to the issue and how a resolution would be formed. My recollection is that we simply kept at it, and it sometimes took months. And groups, small groups would take an issue away and work on it and come back with a discussion piece. The rest of us would discuss it. We would move the discussion along. And there were a number of pieces that took some time.
We knew what we were talking about. We were the resources on these issues. And at the same time, we trained each other to be able to provide leadership on these issues.
We went through the strategies of teaching each other how to cope with a meeting, how to speak, how to get a resolution through, how to not be intimidated by men in union meetings. And if it took somebody, who was worried about standing at the mic and saying something, somebody else went up and sort of, helped them, like stood beside them and said, okay, fine, So there's a lot of mentoring, a lot of support, and that was a very important internal strategy.
SWW had a big presence at all of the union conventions. They had a big presence at the picket lines. We did this kind of flying picket brigade that was hilarious.
Lots of picket lines. In my house and lots of other people's houses too, there was a pile of picket signs at the door where you dropped it when you came in and you pick it up when you go back out again. And it was like, SWW supports this strike.
Strike support around unions who had the courage and the initiative to really stand behind issues that were extremely important for women were really worthy of support. So we would organize strike support, which meant going to picket lines and holding benefits dances so you could raise the morale of people who were on the line, that type of thing.
The union is behind us. The time that I was in Lanigan, there was a strike at the potash mine. That also was an important issue for SWW, that the wives and supporters of the mine workers created a co-op grocery store because it was a long strike. And so we were trying to bring in groceries at a reasonable price for the mining families. And so there was that kind of basic support. And there was also just the moral support of helping out on the picket line and just being there with them to let them know that we were on side.
We shall not be moved. We learned how to work in coalitions, I think, in a good way, because we never tried to take it over. It was a very important thing that you support an issue, other people support an issue. They don't have to be part of us in order to support that issue with the same degree of interest and fervor. And it's a really valuable lesson.
So you're not just dealing alone. I mean, it's a little like the whole concept of unions at all. In other words, individuals are better brought together in a group. Well, also organizations, so coalitions as a strategy, is an important way of building the capacity of the community to respond to a particular issue.
I mean, we did it collectively, and we learned from each other. We developed those responses, and those things are kind of out there now.
It wasn't just theory. It wasn't just sitting around talking and saying, oh, we believe in these things. It was then really trying to act on them, to really try to bring them into organizations or amongst ourselves, and to actually to live what we decided that we believed in.
If people wanted to come to SWW, they would be able to see that we were an organization of principle and that we had a certain program and that that was either attractive or not attractive. But we didn't try to recruit anybody from within other groups.
And the other aspect of SWW that was sort of accidental or serendipitous was the leadership that grew out of the women who participated. So you ended up with Barb Byers and Patsy Gallagher and all these women who took really key leadership roles in the trade union movement and advanced it way beyond what I think our dreams even were at the time.
They did serve as an effective sort of public voice within the trade union movement in particular, but also pushing the New Democratic Party government until it went out of office in 1982 on issues, sort of trying to bridge the gap between the old sort of class-based and populist politics of the province, which were not open to women's issues, and feminism.
One could go through the policies of various trade unions, one could go through policies of government in this province, and you will see the seeds and the reflections of SWW. In my mind, there is no question. And that provides a lasting legacy for not only women in this province, but I think all workers in terms of the equity issues that are now foremost in a lot of the workplaces.
I think that the policy work that we did around any number of issues did have a very, very profound impact. And that was reflected in the debates on the floor of the SFL. Because every year you could see through the resolutions that came forward for debate that all these issues were bubbling up in all kinds of different unions.
The position papers, the analysis we developed, the positions that we took formed the fundamental structures and policies of probably the labor movement in this country with respect to women's issues.
It changed the behavior of men at trade union conferences. How about that? That was a pretty good thing to do.
They were scared of us, which was great. I don't think we realized the power that we had as women until we started to act together.
We left a legacy of challenge, of wanting to challenge authority and challenge things that were wrong in an upfront kind of a way, and a legacy of being supportive of women and hopefully giving our sisters the ability to do the same thing, because that's what makes you whole. That's what really gives you, well, it's what gives you your sort of definition, you know, your self-respect.
Once, you know, the question of inequality becomes at the conscious level, then you're at a different conversation within the community, within the country, and sometimes within the world.
We're scared about who's going to be left when you're gone, because there isn't a women's movement coming up behind you.
I was so inspired that they had the courage to take that on and fight back, and that they didn't just abandon the labor movement. I mean, I think that would be pretty tempting faced with that sort of treatment. Instead, they said, this is unacceptable, this is our movement too, we're not putting up with it.
We need to learn from our mistakes in our past as well as our successes, but those successes and strengths are probably the most important thing for younger women now. Because boy, it's a tough world to be, you know, in your late teens and 20s these days.
If I was going to offer you advice about how to become active and how to seek to make the world a better place, then I would encourage you to find people of like mind. That is the first step. And then to set your goals, to determine what it is you want to achieve, and in small and practical ways to move forward.
The workload involved in being an activist is very, very hard. I mean, you work really hard. I think it's critically important that you sort of take the time out of that time, out of the busy activism, to really think, to talk with others about some of the core issues, and really begin to feed your soul and knowledge.
I guess they shouldn't be afraid of our past or labels, or that, you know, if they're in a situation where they feel like some of these issues aren't getting addressed, then go ahead and pull together a few people. Start small. Start in your kitchens.
There is a number of political issues that need to be addressed. Well, you can't do that alone. You have to do it together. You have to be together, and you have to think about it together, and you have to work out the strategy together, because by yourself you're not very effective. But together there's a great power. There is an enormous power in just the strength of a few women. And SWW may not have been ever very big, but it had a big impact.
I think it's really important for new women activists to know the history of women in the labor movement, to know that what they enjoy today, some of the great gains that they enjoy today were extremely hard fought. It's important to have real healthy respect for the fight that's gone on, for your benefit, essentially. And it's also important that they know the history so they can learn ways to organize today. SWW has had a very strong and passionate way of taking on issues, and I think that they could be really inspired to learn about that, and it might inspire them to say, you know what, I'm going to fight this fight. I'm going to find some sisters and we're going to take it on.
We've got gray hair. They're not going to arrest us, and if they do, what the hell? That'd be fun too. I've never been arrested.